this video, we're going to talk about Hibernate architecture. So what is Hibernate exactly? Hibernate is an object relational mapping Java framework which enables an application to interact with a database. If we take a look at this at a high level, Hibernate has various layers. So we have the persistent objects, which are also known as entities, which ultimately represent the underlying data model. So we can map these entities to tables in our database either using XML or annotations, but annotations are often the preferred choice as they are less verbose than XML and require less coding. But XML was the initial mapping strategy, so it is actually still quite commonly used. Hibernate also provisions persistent object services, meaning it ultimately facilitates persisting and reading data from a database without having to worry about implementing our own data access layer, which, as you may or may not know, is a huge endeavor in and of itself. Hibernate also leverages existing Java APIs such as the Java Persistence API, JDBC, JTA, and JNDI, just to name a few. Now, if we take a look at the Hibernate architecture more granularly, we have various classes in the Hibernate framework, such as the configuration class to load our database connection properties. We have the session factory class, which we can use to open new sessions to interact with the database. We have the session class, which is used to persist and retrieve data from the database. We have the transaction class, which can be used to delineate the start of a transaction and roll back a transaction in the event of an exception or failure. We also have the query object to write HQL, or Hibernate Query Language, and we have the criteria object to add predicates to your queries to filter data. Now, a couple other things we can also do with Hibernate are sort results, we can limit or filter results, we can transform results, and ultimately use projections, which can be used to query only a subset of the attributes of an entity or group of entities that you're querying with the criteria object. Now, if we take a look at the configuration object is typically created first and normally only once during implementing an application, so once at startup. And what the configuration object ultimately does is loads the Hibernate properties file or hibernate.cfg.xml file, which ultimately contains all of the database connection properties that are required to connect to your database. So you will have things in this properties file such as the database vendor, so Oracle, MySQL, SQL Server, and so on. You will have the database connection string, which would be vendor specific. You'll also have the database name, the username, password, as well as the database dialect. Now, another important component to the configuration is the class mapping. So as I mentioned earlier, we can implement either XML or annotation mappings, but in either case, the idea is that we're ultimately mapping our entities or Java classes to our tables so that we are not concerned with writing any of the underlying SQL to persist those entities or fetch those entities from our database. Now, if we take a look at the session and session factory classes, these are a very critical part to interacting with your database. The session factory is initialized once at startup and retrieves new connections by returning new session instances. And the session object maintains the physical connection and is what entities are passed to be persisted. Once the session is closed, the objects that are stored with it are lost, and the connection is released to the connection pool. Next up is are the transaction query and criteria objects. Now, the query object is used to ultimately generate HQL and SQL, which gives us more flexibility around the type of querying that we can perform against a given database. These can actually be used, of course, to retrieve and create data. We can also use these to bind query parameters, which would ultimately take care of things like SQL injection. Now, what we also have is the transaction object. And the transaction object can be used to start a database transaction and roll back a transaction in the event of a failure, so we don't leave our database in an inconsistent state. And then lastly, we have the criteria object, which can be used to add additional predicates to our queries to filter result sets based on certain criteria. And that's essentially the overall Hibernate architecture. There's a lot to learn, and it's pretty exciting stuff, so I do recommend that you get started.